Hello, my name's David Bruce. I've never been a big fan of the term maestro. People use it around big-name conductors, composers and performers. I've only a few times found myself working with an actual maestro, somebody who's unironically addressed as maestro. And I have to say, I've always found it a bit creepy. I suppose you could argue that calling somebody maestro is simply a way of honouring the experience and status of a valued musical figure. But well, those kind of figures tend to get enough honouring in their lives. And the problem with it is it's a way of elevating somebody to a sort of superhuman status. They stop being one of us, they're by default placed on some sort of godlike pedestal, the untouchable maestro.
Maestro Salieri.
Maestroism thrives particularly dangerously, I think, in the big institutions, perhaps because people get a chance to settle into the role over many years. And a few days ago, one of the most maestro-y of all conductors, James Levine, died, having been at the helm of the Metropolitan Opera for 40 years and also at top orchestras like the Boston Symphony. But his career and his reputation ended in ruins after the Met Opera sacked him in 2018, after an internal inquiry found credible evidence of historic sexual abuse against young male musicians.
Our beloved and famed conductor is off the job. The Metropolitan Opera suspended James Levine amid claims of sexual abuse and misconduct.
The stories from people who knew him and worked with him for years have an all too familiar ring to some of those high-profile cases that have come to light in recent years. Someone in a position of unique power with the ability to make or break people's careers, and a surrounding culture that seems to have known what was going on for years, but where nobody dared to speak out for fear of what would happen to them. Now, on his excellent blog, the conductor Kenneth gives a very interesting little anecdote about Levine, where Wood's friend, who is a record producer and engineer, is in a room with Levine and Levine's brother Tom. But the producer is not allowed to address James Levine directly. Instead, he would say to Tom, "I thought the first movement was the best on Sunday and the other three were better on Saturday." And then Tom would turn to James Levine and say, "The producer says the first movement was best on Sunday and the other three were better on Saturday." And remember, they're all in the same room. So then Levine turns back to his brother and says, "Tell the producer I would like to use the first and last movements from Sunday and the two middle movements from Saturday." After which the brother would turn back to the producer and say, "Maestro Levine says to use the first and last movements from Sunday and the middle movements from Saturday," which of course he agrees to. And it's a perfect little anecdote because it points to the same issue I have with maestroism. Somebody who is able to treat another person with such inhumanity to think that they're, not worthy of talking to directly, even if they're in the same room, is clearly capable of thinking of some humans as either subhuman or less human than others. And clearly once you go down that path, you're likely to be more capable of the kinds of abhorrent things Levine is accused of. Kenneth Woods eviscerates the culture, the maestro culture, that allows this to happen, although he saves a lot of his scorn for organisations like the Boston Symphony, who employed Levine when the secret was already pretty clear to everyone in the industry. The difficulty Boston probably faced is that very well-known figures like Levine inspire people. They get everyone excited, from the general public through to wealthy donors. They bring a lot of money with them. I'll never forget the story, for example, of a liberal arts college in the US who couldn't afford a modest new concert hall, but the principal managed to secure a leading world-famous architect whose hall would cost at least 10 times the amount. But because it was now a far more glamorous project, the funds flowed in. Inspiring figures are powerful because of the money that surrounds and follows them. Now, I'm sure it's a difficult position to be in, and it's easy to judge with hindsight, but you just hope that if you were sitting on that board or committee, you'd have the fortitude to say, is this really the kind of person we should be giving a platform to? The Met Opera might have had less initial guilt, as Levine was just 29 years old when he took over there, but it's particularly hard, I have to say, to read their memorial to him on their website today, where the final paragraph, as the Boston Globe puts it, strains under the weight of the passive voice. Despite his undeniable artistic achievements on behalf of the Met, his relationship with the company frayed in the wake of allegations of sexual misconduct. Now, the fact that Levine was able to settle a lawsuit with the Met for sacking him and get $3.5 million, when at the same time the Met itself has not paid its orchestra at all for the entire year of the COVID shutdown, well, let's just say it's not a good look. But I want to look for a moment at the other side of this. If the culture of idolisation and deification seems wrong, it's important to remember that it's also part of what drives art forwards. Inspiration is important to us all. I think it's fair to say most of us wouldn't be able to develop fully without the validation of a successful figure who has cleared at least some of the path before us. We need inspirational figures to drive us on in our own quests. And yet, in most cases, just as glorifying people and calling them maestro gives us a distorted image of them, so there's usually something distorted about inspiration itself. It's often, I sometimes think, a kind of misunderstanding or misreading of the reality. What do I mean by that? Well, one of my favourite examples is the French composer Olivier Messiaen, who analysed Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring, I think it was in the late 1920s, and found all sorts of ways of working with rhythms. He found little units of rhythm which would then expand and contract, or rhythmic cells which he called rhythmic characters, all of which Messiaen went on to develop in his own theory book called Technique of My Musical Language, and which became integral to Messiaen's own approach to music. Now, it's a very interesting approach, and Messiaen's thoughts on rhythm influenced a whole generation of composers to think about abstracting out rhythm as a separate element. And there's no doubt that Stravinsky did indeed clear some of that path, allowing Messiaen to go along the way he did. And yet it's highly debatable whether many of the traits Messiaen found in Stravinsky's piece are actually there, or were actually part of Stravinsky's own consideration when composing the piece. Stravinsky was an inspiration to Messiaen, and yet the influence Messiaen found was really his own highly personal and idiosyncratic way of looking at the world. And that doesn't matter. I'm not at all saying that this is a bad thing, but this is what I mean when I say that inspiration is a kind of misunderstanding. Here's another slightly silly, non-musical example of the same thing. When I started this channel, like a lot of people on YouTube, I found the YouTuber Casey Neistat a very inspiring figure. And let me set this up by saying this isn't a story about Casey doing anything bad at all. It's about how I drew useful inspiration from him, even if, in the end, my understanding of what he was doing didn't quite match the reality. So Casey had this mixture of madcap antics roaming around New York City on his electric skateboard.
You can't fly around New York City on a magic carpet, but get your electric skateboard, some PVC pipe, a great outfit, give Jesse a call, and you can.
A studio I found particularly inspiring in its mixture of obsessive but well-organised clutter.
Today's vlog is a mission. A rescue and recovery mission.
And a rather heady ambition for what he saw as an entirely new art form of the vlog. So behind all the scenes where he'd whiz along the streets of Manhattan or break into an apartment block to rescue a drone that had got stuck on the roof, there was this sense that some new art form was in the air. He'd previously had a series on HBO, but just like the politicians who started embracing the direct contact of social media, he was bypassing the traditional career routes for filmmakers and going direct to his audience. It was all new and fresh and exciting.
When you're a creator, all you need is your phone, an internet connection, and a good idea.
At his peak, Casey set up a company, 368, which was, well, it was hard to pin down quite what it was, but it seemed like an exciting continuation of this journey. A hub where all this new breed of artists would congregate and drive things forward. In truth, I never really knew what it was supposed to be, but it just felt exciting, and I was inspired by it, put it that way. But then, not long after he set it up, he announced he was leaving New York, and he kind of effectively retired from YouTube, and it was all a bit, so all this big talk didn't actually lead anywhere. Now, I don't particularly want to talk Casey down because he's a fascinating figure and who knows what he'll get up to next. But the point I want to make is, even if he does end up disappointing me, it doesn't really matter. What matters is my own personal inspiration that I took from that. It drove me on to actually get going. Along with a couple of other YouTubers, he gave me the idea that actually this is something I could do, this fresh art form, but a musical version of it. I still think today, what would my musical version of 368 be? Or the exciting, inspiring 368 as I originally glimpsed it in my own imagination. It's a path I'm still figuring out, but this slightly inaccurate reading of where Casey was going was one of the things that pointed me in the right direction. So what I'm saying is that the act of idolising someone, of drawing inspiration from them, is an almost essential part of art, but it's very often an inaccurate, distorted view of the idol. In the case of benign inspiration like Casey or Stravinsky, that distortion of reality doesn't matter. It's perhaps even the whole point. But in other cases, that same idolization or distortion can twist or be twisted into something much darker. So the challenge for us, I think, is to allow inspiration and the godlike nature of art and artists to exist without letting the inhumanity of that take over. It certainly is possible. I had the good fortune to work with Yo-Yo Ma when I wrote a piece for his Silk Road ensemble, And while it was impossible not to feel a little tremor of nervousness to be around such a musical giant, you were in no doubt when you spoke to him that you were in the presence of somebody who was treating you with respect as a human being. I have a distinct memory of the sensation when I first met him in person, of a sort of wave that came with him into the room, sweeping away any sense that you should somehow bow down in deference to him. He just wanted to talk to you directly, human to human. And coming from such a godlike figure, that was a very powerful thing to feel. So I can't really speak to the terrifying horrors of what Levine is accused of, but I do think we should be very wary of any kind of inhumanity in the way that we treat others. Artistic power, just like any other, has the tendency to corrupt. So if you see somebody powerful pulling rank, talking disrespectfully to you because you're somebody unimportant, or even humiliating you because you don't know such and such, just remind yourself that this is a fault in them, not in you. The more powerful they are, the less they should be allowing themselves to treat people like that. And if you encounter someone who refuses to speak directly to another person who's in the same room as them, well, my advice is simply steer well clear. But what about the art such people create? Should we ban it? Should we stop listening to Wagner because of his anti-Semitism, to Michael Jackson, to Miles Davis? Should we ban the works of Picasso because of his treatment of women? Well, probably not, although at the end of the day, that's a personal choice. But when such people are alive and in positions of power, then absolutely we should do everything we can to stop them being in situations where they can use their power to abuse. It seems absurdly obvious to say that, but it seems it still needs saying.